Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren, and for my book review, I did The Sexual Politics of Meat by Carol Adams. So, The Sexual Politics of Meat is a feminist vegetarian critical theory originally published in 1990 by Carol Adams. Carol is an American writer, feminist, and animal rights advocate. This book is by far her most famous, but she has written many other books that challenge the sexist meat eating world. She's a sought after speaker throughout North America and Europe and has been invited to hundreds of campuses to share her Sexual Politics of Meat slideshow, which she consistently updates to include modern issues and representations. The sexual politics of meat in particular has gone on to have a great impact on not only the vegan community, but on curious readers all over North America and Europe as well. The book has proven to be somewhat controversial as it explores the connections between feminism and vegetarianism, or more specifically, the connections between the cultural misogyny ingrained in our society and our culture's obsession with meat and masculinity. According to the preface to the 10th edition, most people who have read this book have never really heard of these ideas or theories before they read it, but after reading, they're continually reminded of the legitimacy of the theories through examples all around them that they had never really recognized before. So the sexual of meat is split into three parts, which is the three parts are the patriarchal text of meat. The second is from the belly of Zeus. And the third is eat rice, have faith in women. But before I dive into the three parts, I want to describe a main concept brought up in the book that is used and elaborated upon throughout the entire thing. This is the idea of the absent referent. So behind every piece of meat is an absence. This absence is the death that the animal, the death of the animal whose place the meat takes. So this is that absence is the absent referent. The function of the absent referent is to hide any evidence of the violence that is inherent to meat eating, and also to protect the conscience of the meat eater. The absent referent allows our meat to be separated from the idea that he or she was once an animal, allowing for moral abandonment of the meat. Animals become absent referents in three ways. So the first is literal absence, which means that the animal is dead. It's no longer there. It's now a piece of meat for us to consume. So it's literally absent. The second is definitional absence. So when we eat animals, we change the way we talk about them. I've already done it multiple times by saying meat instead of animal. When we eat pigs, we say pork or bacon, and beef for when we're eating cows. This helps us to forget the things we're eating were once living animals, allowing us to consume them without really any guilt. The last way that animals become absent reference is through metaphorical absence. So this type of absence is discussed a lot throughout the book, especially in the first part. The metaphorical absence means that animals become metaphors for describing other people's experiences. So the animal is then absent because the person is actually referring to something or someone else. The example that Carol Adams uses a lot is when rape victims or abused women say, I feel like a piece of meat, or I felt like a piece of meat. The absent referent can be anything whose fate is transferred to a different hierarchy of meaning. In this case, an animal's fate is absorbed into a human-centered hierarchy. And in Adams' words, the death experience of animals acts to illustrate the lived experience of women. The idea of the absent referent also presents itself in human culture as well. We as a society like to distance ourselves from whatever is different by equating it with something we've already objectified. So this is apparent in the oppression of different groups such as women and in the concept of racism. Absent referents prevent us from experiencing connections between ourselves and oppressed groups. Sorry. So we're going to move on to part one. So this is part one, the patriarchal texts of meat. So the first part begins by stating the fact that people in power have always eaten meat. Dietary habits have always proclaimed class distinctions and patriarchal distinctions as well. So women who have been considered second-class citizens, especially in the past centuries, have eaten what would be considered second-class foods in a patriarchal culture, which are grains, vegetables, and fruits, rather than like meat and protein. Our society has shown over and over again in countless ways that meat is a masculine food and meat eating is a male activity. Where poverty has forced a deliberate distribution of meat, men have received it. So there's studies from that time when there wasn't a lot of meat, and a lot of women would say, like, when they got the meat, they got like little amounts of meat. A lot of women would say, I keep it for him, he has to have it. So instead of rationing it out amongst the family, they just keep the meat for the man because there was this idea that the man has to be the one that has the meat. This pattern is also observed in famine situations today where women starve at rates disproportionate to men. This phenomenon was studied by Lisa Leghorn and Mary Rudkowski in their book, Who Really Starves? Women and World Hunger, where they concluded that women participate in deliberate self-deprivation, meaning that they offer what are considered to be the best foods at the expense of their own nutritional needs. So for example, Ethiopian women typically prepare 2 meals for their families, one for the males, which is like stuffed with meat and protein, and one for the females and children, which contains no meat or substantial amounts of protein. In fairy tales, we see a lot of like big, scary masculine characters being like the cannibals, or the just like eating a lot of like the favorite animals in the fairy tales, and the women that tend to be the cannibals, like the token cannibals, always end up being witches. In cookbooks, the barbecue section are often addressed to men, especially from like in the 1900s and late 1900s as well. The Mother's Day section is usually filled with recipes that don't have any meat and contains mostly vegetables and grains. Cookbooks and menus at a time where meat was scarce contained meat sections that were titled for the men only, which is also something we can see down here in the Campbell's Soup ad. So that is a real thing. So this idea of meat being a masculine food comes from the concept that men need to be like big and strong in order to uphold their manliness. The protein will help them with this, as will the feeling of power that comes from eating things that were once living and having control over them. This concept easily transfers to the oppression of women. Far too often we see or hear men abusing and raping women in order to achieve a sense of control or prove their own masculinity, often to themselves. A majority of sexual abusers have a history of animal abuse, and in these situations, both animals and women are absent reference, not seen as themselves, but seen as something that seen as a thing that they can provide, or a way that they can be used. Women saying that he made me feel like a piece of meat only really upholds this point. In the book, Adams presents the similarities between rape and meat eating and animal abuse in many different ways, one being that in the same way that women are sexualized against their will and held down and raped, animals are butchered or made to produce against their will and treated as objects just as women are. As shown in the images on this slide, there are many real pictures and advertisements to prove the reality of this concept. Just as certain parts of the female body are more valuable to men than others, certain parts of the animal have more value as meat. These ideas are often combined from meat advertisements in order to appeal to the male meat eater, which you can see in that old Arby's ad in the corner. That's real. So part 2 is titled From the Belly of Zeus. So the title of this second part of the book comes from the myth of Zeus and Metis. Zeus lusted after Metis the Titaness, who went to great lengths to escape him until she was finally caught and became pregnant. An oracle of Mother Earth proclaimed that this child would be a girl, and if Metis were to conceive again, she would bear a boy who would be fated to dispose of Zeus. Therefore, after seducing Metis, Zeus opened his mouth and swallowed her, and that was the end of Metis. The second part of the book tackles the term dismemberment and its relationship to both animals and feminism. It's clear what's meant by dismemberment of animals, as this is how we obtain food from them. However, dismemberment also occurs for vegetarians in terms of vegetarian texts. So vegetarianism in texts also is often ignored or fails to provide meaning or context for vegetarianism, deeming it meaningless. In text, the meaning of vegetarianism is often bent just to add to the dominant discourse of meat. For feminists, the dismemberment of text is a major issue. Women's texts have been excluded from literary history or twisted to serve a different purpose all throughout history. Women's voices are muted, just as are animals, and Metis was Metis's. This section goes on to discuss a well-known, This section goes on to discuss well-known stories and texts that had originally featured vegetarianism, but have been twisted over centuries to ignore the existence of vegetarianism. Powerful characters and stories such as Frankenstein originally had many vegetarian themes, but have since been forgotten, which helps to support the idea of vegetarianism being feminine. The section also discusses women in power and the lack of that correlated with war and violence. The normalization of the hunting and butchering of animals makes it easier for humans, especially men in war, to murder other humans without care. Feminists have argued that it's male dominance, not male traits, that have led to so much political violence and the absence of female power that has caused war. Women are natural nurturers and peacemakers, and the lack of females in power has led to the normalization of violence against both people and animals. And so lastly, part 3 is titled Eat Rice, Have Faith in Women. So this part argues that vegetarianism is a symbol of female autonomy and signals a rejection of male control and violence. In this section, Carol Adams states that feminism must be informed by vegetarian insights, just as animal rights theory requires that we incorporate feminist principles. Women often find themselves muted within dominant culture. However, they often become the source of insights into the oppression of animals. So major feminist figures such as Alice Walker and Audre Lorde have contributed to the works that challenge the sexual politics of meat. Adams also states in this section that in linking vegetarianism and women, she's not implying that vegetarianism is only for women, but she does state that vegetarianism without feminism is incomplete. In addition, Adams notes the need for a wider understanding that up until recently, grains and beans have been the source of sustenance for most of the world, and a variety of cultures have depended on vegetarianism. This knowledge helps us to dislodge our Western focus on meat. She concludes this section and the book by speaking of the vegetarian quest, which is a pattern of adopting ethical vegetarianism, and that's her own pattern that she created. The vegetarian quest consists of, number 1, the realization of the nothingness of meat. Number 2, naming the relationships one sees with animals. And 3, finally, rebuking a meat-eating and patriarchal world. Personally, I believe that the concepts and theories that Carol Adams presents in The Sexual Politics of Meat are not only very legitimate, but are incredibly well supported and proven. She explains every concept so thoroughly so that there should be little chance of confusion. Her more complicated theories she goes into even deeper to further prevent any sort of doubt from the reader. It's obvious that she knows that this concept as a whole is very hard for many to wrap their head around, and she writes with that in mind. In addition, she didn't write this book for one specific group of people, and it's obvious that she kept in mind the diversity of her readers while writing. She made this book approachable for all different groups of people so that they felt that they can educate themselves on this topic without having to be like super educated on feminism or vegetarianism. Every thought she has is supported by strings of both historical and modern evidence, making it impossible to question the actuality of the issues she presents. Adams does a great job of using common examples so that it's easy for the reader to recognize these issues in their own life, making her theories even more convincing. In my opinion, Carol Adams made an exceptionally strong case for the existence of the sexual politics of meat and tackled nearly every possible aspect of the issue she could have. I thoroughly enjoyed this book, and I strongly recommend it to literally everyone. Thank you.